Chair, we are now, or we're just about to be live.
So we are live now.
Not yet, just it's computer's doing setting it up. So I'll let you know when it gives me the notification that it's going. Somehow there's a delay.
Yeah, the wonders of technology.
We're now live, and so we can begin our meeting.
Okay. We've had regrets from Marty. Have we had regrets from anybody else?
And Mark.
So it's just
Hello,
Marty then.
I've just joined.
Hello, Gail.
Hello, sorry, we had an internet problem.
Things like that happen. Okay, well, it's according to my clock, it's 2:32, so I guess we should get the festivities underway here. I would just ask that people would keep their microphones turned off until they're asked to speak. As a note for everyone, I want to remind everyone to be respectful with your questions and comments today and to observe proper decorum throughout the meeting. Harassment or incendiary language will not be tolerated. I want to start off with the recognition of traditional territories. We begin this meeting by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of the Indigenous people. That being said, do we have any additions or deletions to be made to the agenda? Hearing none.
Peter, I think you were going to make an addition to the agenda. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yep, there we go. Yeah, I wanted to make an addition to receive the delegates' presentations on the Mountain Locks Park, please.
Okay. The only change that we're making to the agenda is that Stephen Remus will not be joining us today. So the item about 321 St. Paul Street is going to be deferred until February. Otherwise, do we have a motion to approve the agenda? Robert, thank you. Do we have, has anybody had a chance to look at the November minutes? I think they looked okay, detailed as always. So do we have, there's no questions or comments about them. Do we have a motion to adopt the minutes?
I'll make that.
I'll make that motion.
Peter, thank you. So we've already had the motion to about mountain locks, courtesy of Peter. So I guess we'll be moving on to that item.
May I ask, have I missed any new business offering? Have you mentioned before I came on?
No, just about mountain locks.
Okay, so you're going to be asking if there's any new business.
Do you have something you wanted to add?
At the very, very end, under new business, I would like to talk about ongoing communications problems in general, not necessarily at this meeting, but for the next meeting. I just want to give a heads up on that for the next meeting. Is that okay?
Okay. So before we
Mr.
start,
Chair, if I can interrupt for a second, you haven't asked for a vote to approve those minutes.
I thought I did. Oh, sorry. So all in favor? Done. Okay, thanks. So before we start on to the mountain locks discussion, I just wanted to make a few comments in relation to it. Normally, it takes a lot to raise my ire and to make me, speak about stuff like this. And this is an issue that was brought before the committee last July, and it's a rare occurrence for the committee to receive a request from an outside individual or a group to reconsider a decision that it's made. In all my years as a member of the Heritage Committee, this has rarely happened. Likewise, it's a rare occurrence for city staff and the Heritage Committee to be the subject of disrespectful, bullying, and threatening emails, as well as posts on social media, both public and private. Some of these emails and postings have alleged that delegates were somehow denied the right to express their opinions about the expansion of the Plaza parking area at last July's meeting. And some of these postings and emails also seem to imply that the Heritage Committee was complicit in efforts to silence the public. This could not be further from the truth. To begin with, that would be in violation of Section 10 of our procedural handbook, which governs our conduct, and it explicitly states that our meetings are to be open to the public unless there's just cause to exclude someone for grounds such as improper conduct. It should also be kept in mind that in July, we were just emerging from the first lockdown in the pandemic. We were conducting our first virtual meetings. We were working with a system that we were rather unaccustomed to. Errors were bound to happen, and for that we can apologize. The late receipt of submissions only further frustrated the situation. For today's meeting, I have to note that we've received submissions from delegates and from the public at the 11th hour, Monday, Wednesday, and even today, we've received communications. This is a very short time frame for the members of the committee to review all the documents, and I would remind the public that submissions should be sent to the attention of this committee in a more timely fashion. I would conclude my remarks by saying that I was dismayed by the tactics exhibited by some members of the community with regard to this agenda item, not just because city staff are being discredited, but also because my name and the reputation of the Heritage Committee has been dragged into the foray. I'm extremely proud of the members of the Heritage Committee, who are a hardworking group of volunteers. They're dedicated towards working towards the preservation of our city's built heritage and heritage resources. We made the best decision on the Mountain Locks Park expansion last summer that we could, after evaluating the submissions and hearing from the delegates that were present at that meeting. To suggest that there was some sort of conspiracy set into motion and to deny anyone a chance to be heard is a blatant falsehood and a shameful allegation. So, I've got that off my chest. So, I guess at this point we'll be moving on to hear from our delegates. And I understand that Colleen wishes to be first to speak.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, my name is Colleen Beard. I am the Librarian Emeritus, Brock University, in the Maps, Data and GIS Library. And I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. I just want to clarify before I begin that Dr. Monk and myself, and I'm pretty sure I can speak for Dr. Monk, have been corresponding with the committee on this issue since it began in February, and I just want to acknowledge that. Specifically, we've been corresponding with Brian and Chloe, and now with Michael Seaman. And you have been very gracious in informing us all along the way of the committee meetings that were taking place. We were invited to the March meeting, which I believe this issue wasn't taken up until July, which you mentioned, Brian. We were invited to that meeting, but Kimberly and I submitted correspondence in place of attending that meeting. And you did indeed consider that information that we sent along. And although the meeting didn't result in our anticipation, but you did include the archaeological monitoring, which we thank you very much. So I wanted to clarify that, and thank you for informing us along the way. I have read the minutes of the July 23rd meeting, and I have reviewed the minutes of the November 12th meeting where there was an extensive Q&A. I noticed that there was no discussion about whether or not this proposal from the Allen Group was going to compromise Lot 15. Now, I'm sure that it was discussed. I'm quite certain it was, but I don't see that specifically in the minutes. But I'm sure that city staff has had the opportunity to assure you that there would be no conflict between Lot 15 and this parking lot expansion. However, I'm convinced that this is not true, and this is what I am here today to inform you of new information. So along with my correspondence that I have submitted, and that is file SCHAV, sorry, it should be C, but it's V Beard. I included a diagram, and if you could refer to that, or I don't know if somebody wants to share their screen, but if you could refer to that diagram.
I'll share the screen.
And that's what I'm going to focus on. So it shows an overlay of the expansion of the parking lot with reference to the current landscape. And I'm going to, thank you. And I'm going to briefly explain the process that I took to get to this point. So I have access to GIS software, which is nothing different than what the city or the Niagara region uses for mapping. It's called ArcGIS, a geographic information system mapping software that geographically aligns geographic information to the Earth's latitude and longitude very, very accurately. So the underlying aerial imagery that you see, which is ortho imagery, which I have access to from Niagara region, the same information that the city and the Niagara region use. I use that for my base layer, very accurate. I overlaid the Allen Group diagram, the site plan of the expansion parking lot over top. And what I can do, it's called a process of geo-referencing. And I select similar points to the imagery and the site plan, which for one is the example of the existing parking lot, which I can see from the aerial imagery, the curve, and also from the plan. So it's kind of like putting pinpoints in these specific sites and registering the site plan to the real landscape. So I did this so I could get a very accurate measurement of exactly what was going on and what was proposed. And although I could do this by calculating from the scale of the map, but using the GIS system, the Geographic Information System, I can get a much more accurate measurement because this was not indicated on the site plan. And by the way, I would have preferred to use the site plan in the original application by the Allen Group, but this is the site plan that I took from the corporate report, the city planning recommendation. I have requested the original application from the Allen Group, from the city, but on a couple of occasions, but I have not received that yet. So this is the one I'm using. I assume they are the same. Anyway, I took the measurements. So you can see that the measurement from the existing boundary to the proposed is 16 meters. So I went out to the site. I wanted to lay this on the ground. So I went out to the site with the measuring tape. And also I should emphasize too that I have this in my web application, the Historic Welland Canals Mapping Project, which I can see on my phone when I'm actually out in the field. But using a measuring tape seemed to be actually more accurate. So I took a measurement from the curb of the existing boundary and measured 16 meters. Now the top one to the north, that was easy to do because it's fairly level landscape. However, the bottom one, where you can see that's indicated with the yellow dot, that was a little bit more difficult because there's just probably a 6-foot berm in the way. So I couldn't get much of a sight line, but we managed to get a sight line. But what I did was I took measurements from the inner lock wall of lock 15 and measured to the proposed extension. And that's about a 7-meter distance. So I did that along the several sight line that you see there where the proposed extension boundary is. So I could get a sight line to where that yellow dot. Sorry if I'm confusing you, but as you can see, the yellow dot really symbolizes where that intersection is to the extent of the proposed boundary. As you can see with the yellow line, I mean, it is true that the proposed parking lot is not going to interfere with the lock 15 wall, but I have to stress that there are more elements to a lock than just the lock chamber, which is getting all the attention and where the focus seems to be. But there is this wing wall that fans out and flares out from beyond the gates of the lock. And this is where there is going to be a conflict. I am almost certain that there is going to be a conflict. What I did was when I laid out this extension parking lot on the ground, I went out to the site several times and did this measurement, as a matter of fact. I just didn't do it once. I've done this measurement 3 times. And my shovel hit where that intersection is, where the lock wing wall is, and the boundary of the extension. So I am pretty certain that there is going to be a conflict with hitting the lock wall should this proposal go forward. I also want to bring up another point. I'm hearing that the park is underutilized. It's not used as much as it could be. I mean, that's for every park, as a matter of fact. But the fact that it's being said that it's underutilized, I really don't know how this is measured. Unless you do a study, and I really don't think there was one done. And if there was a report that sort of led to this claim, I just think it's hearsay. I've been out to that park many times, and there's always people walking within the park and along Merritt Trail, and it's well trodden. If there is a perception that this park is underutilized, it's probably because the city does not do a very good job at boasting or promoting their canal heritage, their only canal heritage park. And I'm not just making this up. This is actually written in the parks policy plan and as a weakness. But it's researchers like ourselves, the canal and heritage advocates, that educate the public. And instead of forfeiting a chunk of our heritage for profit, for the private sector, I just wish we could leverage this gem that we have in the middle of the city to our own economic benefit. Perhaps something like they've done with the Rideau Canal. I just don't think a few parking spots is going to increase the usability of this park. I think we've tried that before. There used to be parking across the street, which is now a parkette. So there is a little bit of parking along Bradley, but if we're going to make parking available and make this a real destination park, I don't think extending the parking lot at the plaza is where to do it. I just want to end by saying we have an incredible display of Second Canal remnants, not just Mountain Locks Park, but all the way from Lock 5, from Westchester Avenue, right up to Lock 21. Every single lock is visible except for lock number 14, which is right beside Sobeys and which was buried, I believe, by the city back in the 1960s. We have met with the Greening Committee back in 2014 about uncovering this, but that is the only missing link. And as I said before, I'll repeat it again, it would be wonderful if we could leverage this for our own economic benefit. So the only thing I want to say here to end is, if nothing else, I really urge the city staff to take a pause, step back, and verify this claim that there might be a conflict with the wing wall and the construction of this parking lot. If nothing else, just investigate it a little bit more before we move forward with this proposal. And thanks again for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. Does anybody have questions for Colleen before we move on to the other delegates? Carlos?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's for you, Colleen. What kind of investigation are you suggesting? Is this like an archaeological study you're suggesting, or just research by the planning department?
Well, it could be twofold. It could be, I know there's skilled staff at the city, engineers that could do an engineering report, but I very strongly suggest that an archaeological assessment is done before this goes any further. My shovel has hit the wing wall, and I started a little bit of shoveling. It is under the surface, but I am not an archaeologist. I hesitate to go any further. I think my colleague, Dr. Monk, will get into that a little bit more about, she is the archaeologist. I would prefer that she might answer this question, and I'm sure she will, but I strongly suggest an archaeological assessment be done.
Lorraine?
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Colleen. That was very well explained, and I appreciate your thoughts. I just want to clarify and make sure that we understand. We had said in our original motion that we wanted an archaeologist on site while the expansion took place. So are you suggesting that instead of being on site during the expansion, that the archaeologist study happen before? So what's the timeline you're looking for?
Yes, that's correct. I think an archaeological assessment before. I'm not quite sure. I do acknowledge that you did include archaeological monitoring on site. I'm not quite sure what that means or what that entails. I would hate for a big oops to be done if that's the case, if we waited to that point, because that cannot be reversed. If we run into a wing wall with a bulldozer, that can't be reversed. I really strongly suggest that this be done prior to any construction. I would prefer it not go through at all, but that's not my call.
Thank you for that clarification.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chair, just some clarification, particularly with your experience in archaeology. I had an experience with the condo that is being built at the bottom of Dalhousie Avenue, which, as everybody here knows, is about 10 feet from where Lock 1, or the harbor lock of the first canal, the first Welland Canal, is buried. And there they were asked to have an archaeologist on site. And I was horrified to learn that when a neighbor called to say that they had found some timbers and other things, that all they had to do, and my understanding is that all they were required to do under provincial legislation is just to record or catalog whatever was found, but that didn't in any way interfere with or stop the process, the progress of the project. Am I correct in that reading?
Kimberly, you might want to wade in on this one. You're on mute.
Thank you, Brian. I don't want to steal if you have other questions for Colleen, but essentially what I will be getting into are the standards and guidelines that we as archaeologists have to abide by in order to undertake any consulting work in archaeology for a development company. And I'm glad you brought that up, Mr. Garcia, and Councillor Garcia, apologies, and because it raises an issue that I don't think is being considered by most development companies. And in effect, this project should have triggered an archaeological assessment. I have, in fact, been in touch with the ministry. Ministry changes their name every couple of years, so I may have to refer back to the full name for the ministry right now is, of course, the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, Culture Industries, and the Archaeology Program Unit. I have been in touch with them, and in fact, they were surprised at what has happened here. They said basically what I've said in my notes is that archaeological monitoring cannot be done in the absence of a stage 1 and stage 2 assessment. And importantly, that this project should have triggered an archaeological assessment. I don't know why that hasn't happened. I don't know why this wasn't flagged originally. Again, I'm sort of getting into a little bit of what I was going to talk about, but essentially what I didn't realize with the Heritage Committee, and was actually rightly brought up by Margaret Josipovic, who I think was with us or is with us. Yes, thank you. She brought up some excellent points in her minutes of the meeting in November, which highlight some of the opportunities that the committee had to concern themselves with this issue, to again consult with Niagara Region, to reach out to the ministry to ensure that they were abiding by the archaeological regulations, standards, and guidelines that are necessary for any development to occur. So ultimately, the fact that that the committee did not recommend actually or suggest that this go back to Niagara Region and that they could call on an archaeological assessment. Again, part of one of the things that Margaret Josipovic had brought up was, of course, that the bylaws of the Heritage Committee do not allow for the Ontario Heritage Act Part 6 for them to basically speak on the Ontario Heritage Act Part 6. You are basically within Part 4 and 5 of the Ontario Act, but you can't speak on the archaeological resource. That necessarily has to go back to be called upon for an archaeological assessment. Clearly some of this has all been as a result of pandemic, a lack of communication, and ultimately perhaps a slight lack of misunderstanding perhaps by the committee to what really they are responsible for. Again, there is, the heritage committees across Ontario, municipal heritage committees are so important to managing heritage projects, to having a voice for the community on these subjects. But they can't be expected to know everything. They can't be expected to undertake a risk assessment for archaeological resources, particularly when there probably is no capacity in terms of a professional archaeologist on their committee. I am a P licensed archaeologist, and some of you know that I obviously am undertaking an archaeological project in the city of St Catharines. So I've had some experience, not as much experience perhaps as, say, a consulting firm such as ASI, and I certainly would have expected that the committee might have reached out to them for their advice on this subject. It's a complicated subject, but I think it bears very careful consideration by certainly the committee. And unfortunately, I guess it's now past that point. But then now it has to come back to the council, because again, this should never have come to this point. It should never have come to the point where the committee had this heavy responsibility to undertake, to determine what the steps were for archaeological conservation of this particular site. And unfortunately, the recommendations then that you have basically confirmed with the Allen Group, or certainly with the City Council, are ill-advised. If the development group now goes forth and does what they want to do, they are going to be contravening the Ontario Heritage Act. So it puts them in a bad position. Ultimately, it compromises potentially their ability to work. So what I would highly recommend is that, ultimately, for one, the Niagara region needs to get involved in this, because apparently they are the ones who deal with archaeological work within the city of St Catharines. And then ultimately, to have advisorial commitment by perhaps the Ministry of, again, the Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Heritage, to, again, verify the aspects of what this involves. For an archaeological assessment to occur, basically, in my notes, I put a stage 2 and stage 3 assessment. I would suggest or correct perhaps and put forth a stage 1 assessment, which basically is a desktop assessment, and ultimately looking at the historical archive of materials, any oral histories and background, certainly about the particular lock, but also usually a site assessment involved in that. Your stage 2 assessment basically takes on a more physical examination of the lock to determine the boundaries of that, or at least to determine that there is archaeology. Once that passes, of course, you move on to a stage 3, which then becomes a bit more invasive. What I would stress is that this really needed to be the call that was made by the committee. I had made this suggestion to Chloe on the 28th of February, and then, of course, the notes that Colleen and I had prepared went to the committee in July, and of course, they weren't. Well, archaeological monitoring was considered, but not an archaeological assessment. And I have to stress, these are different. Archaeological monitoring happens after or in conjunction with an actual development project, but only after a stage 1 and stage 2 assessment have been undertaken, not in lieu of. And that has to be stressed. Any archaeology where the proximity and potential for aggravation of an archaeological monument has to be considered, and ultimately an assessment needs to be filed by a consulting archaeology who is licensed with the province of Ontario. This project can't go on without that. So I'm sorry that this has, had an evolution that has gone on for as long as it has, but I had, hoped or assumed that the committee might reach out to and consult with someone within the archaeological community, given the proximity and clearly bearing on this lock. And now, as a result of Colleen's study, as a result of course, hinging on this wing wall, which of course is clearly sensitive. I mean, this is a limited resource. When one of the documents that I've been sent by the ministry, and ultimately they will be in touch consistently with me now, was from their Heritage Planning Committee. And under the Heritage Planning Act in the 2020 Public Policy Statement, significant built heritage resources and significant cultural heritage landscapes shall be conserved. Again, any site alteration has to be considered under an archaeological assessment. So this is where we're at. You know, for one, again, I wonder if this should have even been brought to the attention of the Heritage Committee now. At the very least, initially, the region should have issued, again, a request for an archaeological assessment immediately. This was not the responsibility of the Heritage Committee to do. And then two, of course, to ensure that that assessment is done and clearly for the benefit, you know, of the developers, so they know where they stand in terms of the archaeology of this site.
Mr. Chair,
Sure.
I'm wondering if that might be a good point in time for me to jump in and just explain to the committee sort of the process that has happened and what has yet to happen in terms of how this might eventually unfold. I think it would be helpful given the comments that we have and just for clarity for everybody. If you'll allow me to do that.
Yep, sure.
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Judy Pehack. I am the manager of planning for the city. And this particular proposal is treated very similar to the process that would be happening for any type of development within the city. So what's happened to date is a proposal went to council from the owners of the KEG in conjunction with discussions with our economic development department and our Parks and Rec department about the potential of expanding this, the KEG's parking lot into this area. And with that report was the concept plan that you have all seen. Excuse me. Where it goes from there, it obviously went to the Heritage Committee for consideration, and they made a decision and forwarded that information on to council for its information. But what happens next is it comes to the planning department, and we circulate that proposal to various internal city departments, to outside agencies such as the region, to you know, any kind of agency outside of the city that we deem to have a relevant interest in this project. And it's through that review process that things such as the proposed layout of the expansion, the separation distance from basically what would be the new curb line to the locks and perhaps the wing wall that you're speaking of. It would address anything that may have an impact on how this parking area should be designed or how it should be redesigned in terms of preserving all the public interests, all the agency interests, and all the interests of various departments. So that particular process has not yet happened. We're at the very, very beginning of that right now. So there's a whole further review that has to happen that will ultimately massage the proposed design to acknowledge all of those concerns. So, you know, there's clearly a level of frustration, I think, on behalf of the speakers here today, on behalf of, you know, certain members of the committee and honestly by staff as well, because a lot of your concerns are welcome and certainly will be heard and will be passed on to the appropriate parties. But it's very early days on this. No decisions have been made. Staff have really not vetted the proposal to the extent that it needs to be vetted. And a report has to go back to council that would include whatever the staff recommendations are. And then there would be a formal agreement that would be, if it goes ahead, there would be a formal agreement that's binding on the property that would require anything that the city wants. So, and financial securities would have to be posted accordingly. So, as I say, it's very, very early days and all of your concerns, it's not too late. Council has not made a final decision and there's lots of room for massaging the design or perhaps going back and saying, listen, we don't think it's a good idea at all, to reflect what Colleen and Kimberly are leaning towards. But, you know, you have to understand it's a process. And every step of the process sort of refines it a step further to the point that staff feel that they can recommend something to council that addresses all of the concerns. And if concerns can't be addressed, we advise council accordingly. So I think what I would recommend at this point is we welcome the comments that are made here today, and that the committee receive them and forward them on to council as part of the minutes, and forward them on to staff as part of the ongoing discussions of this project, so that those concerns are part and parcel of the review process. And I'd be happy to ask any questions of either members of the committee or the speakers.
Okay, thanks. Kimberly?
Yep, sorry, thanks, Brian. So at what stage then does the city start to look and consider archaeological assessment? I mean, how far along does it have to go before it actually triggers an archaeological assessment? And more importantly, you know, how clearly that would affect a development company if they've got money clearly and time on their hands, which they want to know where they stand in terms of a proposal. So, I mean, it's for the benefit of the archaeology, but of course, in the end, it's for the benefit of the development.
The need for an archaeological study would be determined through this overall review process. The application hasn't even formally been, or the proposed hasn't even been formally circulated to all of the different people that it needs to be circulated. And that's what I want to reinforce. It's really, really early days in terms of the process as far as staff is concerned. So, you know, in the next, say, 2 to 3 months, that circulation will probably occur. And out of that discussion, there will be a consideration of whether an archaeological study is required.
A consideration?
Well, I can't predetermine what people will say. I mean, we have our own heritage planner who needs to weigh in on this. We will likely forward it to the region, let them weigh in on it. So I can't predetermine what they will say. I mean, obviously, we're very, very close to a very significant heritage resource here. And certainly we don't want to compromise that any more than, you know, you do. So at the end of that circulation and comment period, we will have the formal comments from these various different groups. And that one of those interests is clearly archaeology and preservation of the heritage element.
So there will be an opportunity then, should they feel that an archaeological assessment isn't deemed needed, to speak to the issue. Is that
from like your opportunity to speak to the issue?
Well, even if we need to bring on a representative from the ministry to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, in due course, what will happen is, and the process is such, and this is really for general public input, not so much for the committee's position, but for general public input. Council has made a decision and directed staff to negotiate with the parties here to expand the parking lot. That is a decision of council. If that decision of council is to be reconsidered to the extent that, you know, they not negotiate with the parties, that has to be a reconsideration of a council decision. And that's not up to the committee to decide. That's up to council to decide. But I think what I would like to advise is let it go through this commenting period and determine where we're at the end of that. And then you can decide what position you want to take with council. And you have to understand the committee is an advisory body to council. They have already provided their advice on this matter. If that were to change, it would have to be at the direction of council.
Thank you.
So, you know, I want to reassure that we understand your concerns fully. We really do. But we have to follow the process, and that process is dictated through various procedural bylaws that the city has to abide by. So we're abiding by our bylaw. And I understand that you're feeling like, to some extent, I'm getting the sense that you feel like you're missing the boat and your message is not getting through. That's not at all what's happening. I understand your frustration, but trust me, we understand where you're coming from. We hear what you're saying. And the minutes of this meeting together with, you know, I'm the one that will review the recommendation to council, presumably when this comes back, or be part of the team that does. So, you know, given the emails and the back and forth that happened to date, we hear you. We understand your concerns. And again, I just imply that you just wait for the process to unfold as it should.
Okay. Colleen, I thought you had your hand up to make a comment or question.
Thank you, Brian. Well, I just wanted to ask, and I think I did read somewhere in a report that construction was going to start spring 2021. And I think that's what gets the back of our hairs up anyway. But anyway, I assume that's not going to happen.
Through you, Mr. Chair, no.
Good. And just to add to that, how would we be informed of the progress that is going on at the city? I think that's the most.
Okay. So, and this is where I want to be perfectly clear. And I don't want you to misread what I'm going to say here. Technically, the process is through an agreement that would authorize the terms and conditions and how this parking lot would be constructed, is called a development agreement. There is no legislated requirement for public input on a development agreement. Having said that, council could direct in this particular case, if they chose to, that there be some sort of public input forum as part of this development agreement that would go above and beyond the requirements of the Planning Act. And that would be up to council to direct staff to do that. So if that's what you want to happen, then you need to contact a councillor that would be prepared to put that motion in front of council.
Correct. Okay, thank you.
That's the process under which that would happen.
Okay, thank you. I just had one question going back to Colleen about the wing wall. And maybe Kimberly can answer this one as well. How substantial is the construction on that wall? Like, is it like huge masonry blocks like the ones that the locker is made out of, or is it just like smaller, like rubble or something that might have been, packed together and cemented together? I mean, what is it? Is it something as spectacular as what the lock masonry is?
Yeah, Kimberly might be able to answer too, but from beyond the gates, so beyond the lock gates, the masonry is quite substantial to a certain point as it starts to flare out from the lock wall. Now, the construction of the wing wall is not as substantial as that part just beyond the lock gates. I would say the part that I'm referring to, and I have a diagram that I didn't include in my correspondence, but I do have a diagram of a typical second canal lock. So the extent of that masonry extends beyond the gate as it starts to flare out. And I think you know what I'm talking about. But as the distance beyond that, it's only maybe a couple feet. At the gate, it's probably a significant 4 or 5 feet. But the wing wall is significantly less. But what we're seeing is that wing wall is perfectly intact and will go down probably about 10 feet. So it hasn't, as far as I know, of what I can tell, it hasn't been demolished. So it's not as substantial as the lock chamber, but it's still fairly substantial. They're stone. They're
because I had gathered some vintage pictures. I put them together as a really short PowerPoint for this meeting, showing the wing walls, or I guess, or what you call the approach walls to a typical canal lock, on both the lower end of the lock and the upper end. And they seem to be two entirely different beasts. I mean, on the lower end of a lock, they seem to drop down quite dramatically, like quite a sharp angle. Whereas on the upper end of a lock, they seem to be more level, and it's a gradual drop away and spreading out from the lock.
And it
So
also,
I was just wondering, in this case, how much, if the parking spots are put in, how much of that wing wall might be starting to drop off at an angle, so you may not be hitting all parts of it during the construction.
that is absolutely for an archaeological assessment to determine.
Right. Okay.
And it also varies lock to lock.
That's right.
Lock 15 is at a junction where the route of the canal actually turned. So it looks like from photos that there was some other structure there as well at the upbound part of the lock, but it's hard to determine. But that's where the archaeologists come in.
Right.
Well, and if I may, not only an archaeologist, but potentially also an architectural historian for canal locks. I mean, for instance, you have an expert in Niagara and Niagara-on-the-Lake at Willowbank. Keith Blades, I think, was one of the specialists who dealt with the Rideau Canal, clearly a National Historic Site. So certainly, where there may be some absence of knowledge in terms of the specifics of lock design, the archaeologist is charged clearly with the responsibility of determining where not only the archaeology exists, but also where a buffer needs to extend to in order so that the conservation of that built heritage is not affected in the long term, as a result of erosion, as a result of other factors in the long term. So again, this is why it's so important, because it is specialist knowledge in part for the lock, but it's also an archaeologist who has to determine this, just again to ensure that they're not going to expand too far and impinge on that, of course, wing wall.
Peter, you had a question?
You're muted.
You're on mute.
Apologies, sorry. There's a good, I believe, a good sample of the Second Canal wing walls at Kiwanis Park and Ontario Street. Okay, everybody been down that park and seen the second, I believe it's the second lock of the Second Canal.
It's a third.
Maybe not. Anyway, there's a wing walls that extend out, which are the same construction and size of stone work that the chamber canal has. Okay, so it's pretty impressive work. Whether that's the same, in the mountain parks, I don't know. The other thing I was just kicking around in my head was if there's an issue with particularly the archaeological, assessment of this area, why not reduce or request that they reduce the parking spaces? They have 27. Can they deal with 22 or 23 or whatever it takes to at least assuage that concern? That's all. That's all I wanted to say. Could that be happen, or present the developer with just less parking spots?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is totally possible. What has been proposed is their version to date. Once we go through this review process, like I say, it could be revised in a multitude of ways to protect the heritage features. So there's nothing, you know, just because that's what's proposed, it does not mean that that's what's going to get approved or be put forward for council from a staff perspective as something council should approve. You know, if I can again go back to the example of it being no different than any development application that comes to the city. What is proposed is reviewed. What is recommended to council is the result of a commenting by all interested stakeholders and a recommendation made accordingly. And 9 times out of 10, it's not exactly the same as what is proposed.
Okay. Lorraine?
Just a quick question, Judy. When I'm thinking about when you talk about this developmental agreement, would you say that it's similar? Is that the same as what was happening with the old Merton High School site when the developer wanted a developmental agreement to build residential sites?
For you, Mr. Chairman, any development that happens in the city, and I'll include, you know, the expansion of a parking lot, which is not actually bricks and mortars. Anything has to have an agreement that binds the proponent to do what the city has asked them to do. It's a legal agreement. It's registered on title. There are financial securities posted by the proponent that ensures that he do what the agreement says he will do. And if he doesn't do it, he doesn't get his money back, basically. Depending on the development type, it could be, you know, I think in the Merton High School, it was more than just a development agreement. It was a much broader, more intensified agreement called a site plan agreement. But the principles are the same. Is it goes through a review process, staff assesses what it should not be. They make a recommendation to council. Council considers it, approves it, denies it, or modifies it further, could send it back to staff for further consideration of certain matters. But ultimately, there is an agreement that is binding, and it's really the teeth that gives the city the power to enforce should the proponent, you know, go bankrupt, or, you know, who knows? Like, there's all kinds of things that happen in the development world that gives the municipality the teeth to ensure what has been approved is actually built on site. So in this particular case, just to use an example, and because we're talking about an archaeological study, you know, perhaps the recommendation to council would be that, you know, an archaeological study be undertaken to determine the best design that best protects the locks and all the infrastructure that goes with it. Maybe, you know, that would be the type of recommendation that would address your specific concern. So until such time as an archaeological study is done, there is no final design, because the archaeological study dictates what that design should be. So until you have that information, you're not really in a position to recommend specifics to council.
Thank you. I was just asking because I thought that analogy, and we haven't heard anything from the developers as far as I know. I thought, what is it? Is it okay to even ask you if you have heard recently from the people at the KEG who are asking for this expansion? Is it something they're still actively pursuing?
Oh, yeah, I think they're active. Well, they're pursuing it. How actively they're pursuing it is another thing, because, I mean, you know, COVID hit all as this was unfolding. So I think, to be fair, everybody's on a delayed timeline for just about everything in terms of the development world. So certainly they want to pursue it. They don't need it for next week because their restaurant's not even open. So, you know, to that extent, it's not urgent or imminent, but long term, I'm sure they still want it.
Okay, thanks very much.
Mr. Sawyer.
Judy, I just wanted to ask you a quick question. You say that this is no different from any other development project, but of course, what does make it different is that it's taking a fairly large chunk of protected municipal land. Does that process not change the procedure, the protocol at the city level, and does it not call for more community input under those circumstances?
I think the difference here is that council, rightly or wrongly, directed staff to negotiate the expansion of this parking lot. You know, that's our direction. Whether it should have been in consultation with the public or whether it should have even be considered because it's public space, you know, you can argue that any which way you want. We're responding to the direction of council at a staff level. But having had that direction, you can be assured that we'll go through every due diligence we have to in order to, you know, primarily in this context, maintain the heritage element and the preservation and integrity of that element. Like, to me, that is the biggest element in this exercise.
And I appreciate that, and I realize that, you know, to some extent, my presentation is not immediately it's relevant, but not immediate. It doesn't specifically speak to the heritage dimension. But then, on the other hand, the whole park is a historical park. I mean, the entire, whatever it is, 55 acres is a historical park. So it is in and of itself a heritage site. So when we start talking about removing portions of it, it would seem to me that that would open up a whole nother level of scrutiny and public input. That's basically what I'm asking. In fact, I was under the impression that there was actually a legal requirement for that when you're talking about parkland. Am I wrong?
Well, I don't agree with you entirely, and this is why. Is any park in the city is zoned as green space. Within that zoning, public parking is a permitted use. And this is a really important part that I want the committee to appreciate, is that the parking that's being proposed here is not exclusive use to the KEG. It is open to public as well. And part of the expression of that is that it be signed accordingly at appropriate places. Now, of course, you can argue if it looks like part of the KEG parking lot, no one's going to think it's public parking. And that's part of the challenge of the terms and conditions and what should be included in this agreement that's registered on title. So, I mean, parking, whether it's in a historic context or whether it's parking in any park in the city, parking is a permitted use in a park.
Yes, but that's presumably to serve the park, not to serve a private business adjacent to the park.
Well, and this is the point I want to make. What's being proposed here is not exclusive to the KEG. It is open to public parking for public access purposes to this portion of the park.
And that's when we need that, do we, to make that park available? I mean, we get into these kind of circles because we know there's really no need for extra parking there. So, and the city may retain actual ownership of the property, but it would be leased to the mall. Is that not right?
Yeah, no, it was a lease arrangement. There's no intent to convey parkland to the KEG owner as a permanent boundary alteration to their site. No, it still would remain in the city ownership. It would be leased to the KEG for parking purposes, but not exclusive parking to the KEG.
But for the time of the lease, it would be occupied by a private corporation.
Well, it would be first come, first serve.
Yeah, but you've leased it to a private corporation. You've leased public land to a private corporation.
Leased in accordance with the terms of the lease. And this is what I keep saying. It is not considered to be exclusive to the KEG. They can use it if it's available, but again, my understanding is it's to be maintained for public access as well, and that the terms of the lease would dictate that. And in essence, it's first come, first served.
No, I understand your point. I did want to point out that we did write Doug Littleton, who's the franchise owner of the KEG, who said, we did not initiate this request. We have no interest in this request. This was initiated by the mall. And it has nothing to do with us. I'd be happy to share that letter if you like.
No, and that's correct. And I've misspoke. Clearly, it's the owner of the whole plaza. It's not the KEG specifically. They just lease it.
Okay, well, I'm still a little bit concerned if Kimberly had a chance to finish her presentation. It seemed to me that you didn't have a chance to finish what you were saying, Kim.
No, I was going to go back and go back to Kimberly. You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm unmuted, I think now.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks Dawn and thanks Brian. I don't want to flog a dead horse. It was just to highlight the issue that exists, certainly at the level of, for the committee and for them, not just for this issue, but of course for any future issues that the committee might have to deal with that, is in regard to archaeological materials. And I didn't know before. In fact, Brian, you might remember it was my email message to you, I think on the 24th or 25th of February, that sort of let you know about the issue of the plaza. And I directed it to the Heritage Committee, thinking at that time that it was the Heritage Committee to respond to these issues. And certainly for all heritage issues, it should be. However, in this particular case, I do think that it just added far too much onto the committee's plate, because it was beyond the perhaps understanding of the standards and guidelines for archaeological, for archaeological work. That again, that needed to be considered. And there were just too few questions asked, I think, about the proposal. The responses were very clear, that were delivered back by Margaret Jaspovic, and I thought they were excellent. They responded to the issues, but there were just too few issues that were raised, I think, by the committee to question how the archaeology might be impacted, or rather, perhaps to ask advice from again, somebody beyond the committee, and what the due process would be. But the only thing I will add to my sort of comments is that we have help. There are a lot of people out there who can assist us to make the right judgment call. I'm an archaeologist. I'm primarily a maritime archaeologist. I deal with maritime materials, and but I also deal with industrial archaeology, clearly. And there are, certainly, we can't be expected to know every type of site. And so we bring in advice. We consult others who may have specialist knowledge. And in this particular case, I did consult with Megan Brooks at the ministry, and again, with her team, who again agreed that there was an issue here. And I just want to leave it there, that as things move forward for Judy and for the others in the city, to reach out to the ministry, because they, if need be, will provide the guidance necessary as things develop to provide the necessary structure for what needs to be done. And again, there's so many issues that, again, a city, a planning department, and certainly a heritage committee have to deal with. Seeking advice is my best and most honest advice that I can provide at this point. Let's celebrate this heritage. We are looking, and again, to repeat my colleagues, we're looking at a bicentennial. I'm looking at the next stage of our grants, which will include 3D examination of the historic canals. We have an opportunity to present a great deal of heritage for the public, and to hopefully move now toward a nomination for National Historic Status. This has been talked about for a very long time, but I would go so far as to say this would deserve World Heritage status. I'm working with folks in UNESCO right now to find out what the process would be for that. But I think this is a very strong consideration that should be looked at. And I would be very happy to speak with the committee at another point to further sort of delve into this with them. But in the meantime, let's deal with this issue on hand, and let's, again, ensure that we can preserve the existing lock. So I will, again, maybe pass this back to, if there's any questions, certainly, but otherwise I will pass this back to Dawn. And Michael, what I if it's okay with you, what I will do is pass on my notes and the responses from the ministry. I don't know if there's any value in that yet, or if the committee would like to see them, but I'd be happy to have a hard copy provided to the committee and to Michael, just so they can see the sort of stream of information regarding archaeological standard and what the response is again from the ministry.
Thank you.
That might be handy to have.
Okay, I'll forward that by email. Okay.
Okay,
All
thanks.
right. Thank you.
Okay, Don, would you like to say your piece now?
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. It's been a fascinating couple of hours. I want to say it's a real privilege to follow Colleen and Kimberly. Just so much objective information here that I think I didn't know, and it is enormously gratifying to get this kind of verification of what, I just think it's great that Kim just called it a World Heritage Site and what that potentially means to us and the potential that we have here. I think too, it's an example, and I want to speak first, Brian, and I think we all feel bad that the situation got more and more tense over time. I think part of it is what Judy addressed, that we didn't maybe know the full process. As you can see, many of us have tried to speak, and because of COVID and a bunch of other issues, that became impossible. And I think some of us, and they began to panic because it felt like this thing was going to be rushed through and end up in council without the kind of scrutiny that we felt it deserved and required. So if there's been some tension along that, I think it's unfortunate, and to the extent that I contributed, I apologize. But I can assure you that all of the input that I'm aware of has been sincerely based on a genuine concern for this site and for the preservation of this parkland. I also think it's interesting, as I was listening here, is that this seems to me to be a perfect illustration of the importance of civic involvement and the importance of getting the community engaged. Because I think, as Judy said, this was presented to the council, and they had no real understanding of the ins and outs and complexities of it. And so the opportunity then to put it out, not just to departments within the city, but to the public at large. We have wonderful expertise here, and people with all kinds of perceptions and observations that need to be shared. And that input is really the essence of a democracy. And I think what we see here, because it was very difficult to tease this out over time, I learned about it accidentally and started to look into it. And, and I had people say that, we're making a mountain out of a molehill, literally. That was one. I thought that was kind of funny. There's just a few feet of overgrown weeds. No one cares about this. And in some ways I understand that, because that's the way they saw it. And it's not that there's anything wrong with that position. It's just that other people have other positions and understand it in a different way and care about it in a different way. So the opportunity to present that seemed to be slipping through our fingers. And, we watched this with some concern and as I said, almost panic. And I think that unfortunately maybe it's kind of affected the tone of our of some of our later communication. And plus, we were told that there's a very good chance we didn't even know for sure if we were going to be able to speak today, because we suddenly learned it was going to take a 2/3 majority, and then we found out 2 days before this that you can't retract your original. So it was. I mean, I don't think anybody felt it was a conspiracy, but we all felt, geez, they're not exactly eager to get our input, and that gets frustrating at the community level. And I'm sure you all appreciate that. And you guys have been caught, I think, in the middle, because it wasn't you that. I mean, you've seen my letter to Daryl Smith, as I say, nobody has more respect for the Parks Department than I have and what they've done in this city. As I say, I think if nothing else, we must be absolutely world class in terms of converting dumps into parks. We've done a great job, and I think obviously we all realize that the limitation is financial, and you can only do so much. My argument, of course, is that, well, I think that this can be, and has been proposed to be, the absolute jewel in the park system of St. Catharines. And really and I'm not, like Kim said, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, and I'm not going to go through all of the stuff I sent you. I'm sure you can read it at your leisure. But I do think that it's important that we do understand that there's other ways of looking at this. Kimberly and Colleen, bless their souls, look at this from an objective point of view. I tend to lead with my heart, as some of you know, and that often gets you in trouble, I agree. But it's who I am, and it's the way a lot of other people are, and they react to this in a way, hey, they can't do that. They can't take our part away. We need to do something. And that's kind of what I wanted to just sort of run by you a little bit today. And as I said, I'm the last person in the world that needs to convince you of the historical significance of this. So, I mean, but I didn't know this until I started looking into it. I didn't realize that in 1850, the Governor General of Canada called it. I didn't know where that term came from. Neptune's staircase. Amazing, incredible. Over 170, almost 175 years ago. I mean, you know, this has always been a World Heritage Site in many ways. And of course, the other concern that I want to point out, and again, it's not immediately germane to your mandate, but there's a real concern about the consistency of city priorities and this proposed transaction. And in particular, I think this is on my slide 4, if you're so inclined. We specifically have within the Garden City Plan the statement that private property encroachments on municipal parkland, open space, and natural areas should not be permitted and should progressively be eliminated in order to maximize the use and enjoyment of these areas for public purposes. It's pretty clear that this is not what they had in mind. And so when we see this, we go, wait, whoa, that's not right. That's not what the city's about. That's not what our officials have agreed to. On the contrary, we have made an exact opposite commitment. And Brian, if you could go to the next slide, thank you. Yeah, and then along with the idea of paving over parkland, we have the whole issue of environmental responsibility. And I took this is out of an article from last year, May of last year, and I don't need to read it to you, but I did want to do one thing. You can see that this was brought, the motion was brought and supported by a bunch of 8th graders, 7th and 8th graders. And so when Bruce Williamson talks about the young people are going to be facing the impacts, one of the real pleasures of doing this work has been that young people have come and said, hey, I would like to know more about this Mountain Lots Park thing. And so we're getting young people saying, well, let's get in. We want to get involved too, which of course is something that we all hope for. And I just wanted to read you a letter from an 18-year-old woman named Charlotte Chan, who she's going to, I guess, send this to the paper. I hope she does. She says, I may only be 18, but I can recognize a bad idea when I see one. And I was shocked to learn how our city approved, in principle, a proposal to pave over a portion of Mountain Lots Park so that the adjoining Glendale Mall can add 27 more parking spaces to its existing parking lot. I know it seems like a minuscule change to the city's layout, right? But no matter the size of a decision, actions speak louder than words. Having recently passed a resolution recognizing that we're in the midst of a climate crisis, the approval of these parking spaces sends an outrageously inappropriate message regarding how seriously this city takes the climate crisis and the response that is immediately needed. Furthermore, it's making an absolute mockery of any pledges or promises St. Catharines has made to work toward a sustainable future right now. Absolutely zero arrows of logic point toward this being the city's next move. Why are we moving backward? Hordes of money can wait, but the planet and my generation's future well-being cannot. I will be writing to my councilors to provide my opinion on the matter. As a resident of St. Catharines, I hope you will too. I think we underestimate the caring that does exist out in the community. And this is just one example. And I think it's an important example because we are seeing young people more and more aware, and we need to be responsive to them. If I could just go to the next slide, Brian, thank you very much. These are slides we often don't see. I'm sure you've all walked this area and you know it, so I don't want to overstate it. But this is the edge of the existing parking place. I mean, we're not dealing here with a hand, a few. This is a huge parking area, and by adding to it, what statement are we really making? Over here on the left, you'll see this is a knoll that would be removed with the proposal. It would be gone, and all of this area from here and well beyond it to the left would be paved. And I think that's important for us to know. This is, people walk here all the time. Underutilized? I don't know. Here's Joe Friday. This is actually on the wall of Lock 15, and he's standing guard and he's going to try to protect us from the pavers when they come. So that's just, but I think it's important that we keep in mind that this isn't just a little tiny area. And when we looked into it, I was surprised myself. It's like, by the time you figure in all the access, it's 11,000 square feet, and it's not just just a tiny little bit of land. And if you go to the next slide, please, Brian. These were taken all last fall, and this is one of the things I really find aggravating. Is that one of the excuses for giving this land away is that the area has been hasn't been maintained. And that it's it's no longer of value because it's been trashed. Well, I mean, yeah, I agree, but maybe what we should be doing instead of selling it or renting it is figuring out how to find the money to bring it back to its glory. I mean, I think about these wonderful masonry walls, as we all know. Some of the best examples of masonry, 19th century masonry in North America. And what have we done with it? This was built in 1845, and it was graffitied in circa 2020. I mean, this is ridiculous. And this is something we need to preserve. We've got trees growing out. We've got trash allowed there. And I'm not blaming the city. God knows they've got enough on their plates. But we have to take responsibility for this, not give it away. And I feel very, very strongly about that. I just want to end, Brian, if you would, with just one last slide there. Thank you very much. I keep hearing this same thing, and rightly so. We could maybe do something like the Rideau Canal. Well, exactly. And I think if in this case, if the committee could recommend it somehow or put in minutes, I don't understand the protocol exactly, that we would like to see this park not only not paved over in part, but in fact identified as the Centennial Park was identified as a target for redevelopment, and we have so many potential benefits that could accrue from this. And I mean, I really loved Kim's comment about it being a World Heritage Site. I think it could be. Think about the significance of that. I mean, geez, you go look at Niagara Falls, and 5 minutes later you think, yeah, okay, done that. Now where do I go? And this is a really magnificent piece of work. And anybody who loves the canals, they go by that masonry, they look at those amazing blocks of lines and how they were put together, how they were with no mortar. It's nothing short of amazing. So anyway, you can see I'm enthusiastic about it, and I just would like to say that rather than endorsing what I think is a really short-sighted application to pave over a portion, instead we identify this as the magnificent park that it is, and work toward redeveloping it so it becomes a major asset and tourist draw. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody have questions for Don? No. Going once, going twice. Okay.
Oh, Brian, sorry. Yeah, just in the nick of time. I just wanted to point out one resource that we actually do have in terms of these canals. And I know there's always the sort of general histories we hear, but I just wanted to point out we actually have a resource that gives a biography of these canals from 1854 through certainly the period, of course, of the third canals, but from 1854 through till, of course, 1881, the period of the second long canals, that identifies every ship, every cargo that went through these locks and gives us tonnage. It gives us the economic value that these canals were to the city of St. Catharines. And we are working on digitizing them from the National Archives, Libraries and Archives of Canada right now, to, again, make them accessible or make them available to anyone who wants to research an individual ship or shipping that goes through these locks. And I think that's, my role as an archaeologist, of course, is to tell the biography of objects. And when we tell, when we inspire, I think, the public about these histories and these critical national histories, I think it reminds them that it's not just a bit of dirty grass and a little bit of an extension of the park, but rather an important monument to our industrial heritage. And I'm looking forward again to working with Brock Library to making them available for the public to use and to refer to. But again, just stressing the monumental value that these canals have, and that we are, again, we need to re-engage as we move forward. And again, I would like to offer a voice as we move forward to work with the committee if there's an opportunity to again help us to see and bring these canals to fruition in a tangible way.
Wonderful.
Okay,
If
thanks.
I could just add something to that. I mean, I don't think we're just here to be critical, and obviously that's the case. I'd love to work with the committee and the city to help raise funds to apply for federal grants for redevelopment. For you think about an orientation center like Kimberly was talking about down at the bottom of the park that brings this alive. I love that term, a biography of objects. If we have a biography of wonderful objects that are irreplaceable or unlike anything else in the world. And I mean, I would love to do that. I would love to start. Let's find out where the money is. And as you said, with the bicentennial coming up, who knows? I know it's been tried before, but let's do it again.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Chair, I don't have my video. I was asked not to put it up because of bandwidth, but if I could follow up with Dr. Okay. Sorry, I was told I could start it again. If I could follow up with Dr. Monk on my earlier question, because just for clarification, like she gave us such great detailed information that I'm not sure what the answer to my question was. So I just want to repeat it. I raised the issue that my understanding was that an archaeologist monitoring a site is not obligated to, it doesn't mean that they can stop the work, but only that if they find some artifacts that they must retrieve them and catalog them. Is that a correct understanding?
That is correct understanding. And I would just like to read one sort of paragraph from the standards and guidelines, which basically says under these guidelines, archaeological monitoring only occurs after stage 1 archaeological assessment and other stage 2 archaeological assessment techniques have been attempted. Archaeological monitoring is meant to be used when there is already a basic understanding of the depth, the extent, and position of archaeological features on site, or after other stage 2 methods have not been able to identify the archaeological resources expected as a result of the stage 1 background research. Again, this is essentially what that development should have undertaken if they didn't. And for whatever reason, I can't believe that they were able to build so close to Lock 1. But Port Dalhousie real estate, of course, is quite valuable, and ultimately having nice views of Lake Ontario superseded any archaeological requirement, but they shouldn't have, clearly. And had that, in fact, been put forth to my colleagues of the Ministry, you can be sure that they would have triggered an investigation. I hope I was better able to respond that time.
Thank you for that. I believe that the ministry was advised at the time, but anyway, it's water under the lock, so to speak. But thank you for clarifying that. I think it's important that the committee understand the difference, because we have talked about both monitoring and doing an assessment, and I think it's something my colleagues and I at council need to understand as well. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, thanks. I wonder if we can quickly go to the slide presentation that I was going to do, Michael.
Oh,
I just put together about half a dozen slides of vintage pictures, showing the different locks of the second well and canal, just so you can get an idea of what these, the wing walls and what the lock structures actually look like. This is a slide. It's a diagram. I think it's from the National Archives in Ottawa, showing what a typical lock plan should look like. I guess the upper end of the lock is on where the direction that the water is coming from is on the left-hand side. The lower end of the lock, of course, is on the right-hand side, and you can see the approach walls and things that are angling into the lock. So I imagine that that's the kind of thing that you're going to be finding in Meriton at the Mountain Lock, something similar to this. And interesting because the lock floor looks like it had interlocking timbers going one direction, then another layer going in another direction, and then timbers on top of that, and I think rammed down with clay in between to make it watertight rather than having a stone floor. At least that was my understanding of it. So we can go on to the next picture. This, of course, is Lock 1 in Port Dalhousie of the second canal. And you can see on the right-hand edge, the masonry sort of steps down. Then you have that lovely curved bit of wall going out. And then you've got the approach wall on the left-hand side. And you can see that it actually starts to angle down quite a bit from where it meets the lock masonry outwards. And I assume that is maybe the kind of thing you assume is the wing wall. Colleen or Kimberly? Could be. I don't know. Anyway, we can go to the next slide.
Yes, it is.
Yep. And this is just another picture of it from a different angle where you can actually more clearly see that the lock masonry from the top of the wall steps down and then it just angles off. Next one. This is an aerial view of Port Dalhousie from about 1920, showing the second canal lock, and it really illustrates quite clearly, how that wall, wing wall, sort of angles off, and it has quite a sharp decrease, and it angles out quite wide. Next one. And this is on the left-hand side is Lock 1 of the third canal in Port Dalhousie. And it still employed the same kind of wing wall construction as the second canal did. And then you can see a little bit of the wing wall, I guess, which formed part of the towpath, extending off up to the top of the slide. Next one. This is, I guess, Lock 3 downtown, below the old Glenridge Bridge. This is the downward side of the lock, and you can actually see that the masonry there again is really dropping off at quite a substantial angle. The view in the bottom is the opposite end of the lock, the upper end of the lock, and you can see that the wing walls were a little bit less spectacular at that end, but even they seem to have a little bit of a downward slope to them. Next one. Locks 13 and 14 in Meriton. Again, if you look at Lock 14 in the background, there seems to be, the walls are angling downward and extending out quite a bit. Lock 13 in the foreground, the wing walls, the approaches seem to be rather low and spreading out to, at quite a wide angle. In the bottom, we've got Lock 22 in Thorold, same characteristic kind of thing, where the curtain wall, if you want to call it that, on the lock curves out, and then the wing wall just, trails off down towards the water level. Next one. I guess these are the mountain locks, the Neptune staircase in Meriton, and here you can actually see the curve of the masonry And I assume that that's part of in the bottom right-hand corner, part of what was a wing wall there. And it doesn't look like it was very much of a structure at all, but just, you know, trailing out to protect the edges of the lock. And the next one. I think this is my last slide. This is actually from Humberstone, or up in Port Colborne. And this looks like an approach to a lock with the bridge going across, carrying a roadway across the canal. And they actually said that this was on the south side of the lock. And it's rather interesting to see that here the wing wall is, you know, doing that really sharp drop, that steep angle. So that's why I'm wondering, with the parking lot proposal, how much of that wing wall might actually be impacted on if you've got this kind of a characteristic drop going down on the masonry. But then again, like you said, an archaeologist will be able to determine that. So that was my little foray into yesterday. So if anybody has any other questions about anything, otherwise, I can only say that the information that we've gathered here is going to be forwarded to city staff for their consideration. And we look forward to working with everybody in a very friendly fashion from this point onward.
Just to thank the committee for their efforts and their time and their clearly love of local heritage, to obviously volunteer their valuable time to this, well, to this and many other efforts. So, you know, on behalf of the others, although perhaps they all want to speak their own turn, thank you, Brian. You know, thank you, Michael, and thanks to the rest of the committees for listening to us. And again, considering, even if things can't change at the moment, considering this and forwarding it, of course, onto council for their consideration.
Thanks. Lorraine?
I just want to say thank you, Kimberly, for your very informative presentation. And I would love to read the notes that you have. So please do forward them, and thank you in advance.
I will copy them to Michael and to Brian, if that's okay. And then I guess they'll forward it to everybody else. All right.
Thank you.
Okay.
So if I can get someone to make the following motion: that the Heritage Advisory Committee receive the presentation from Colleen Beard, Isabel Bachman, Dr. Monk, and Don Sawyer regarding Mountain Locks Park for information purposes, and that the staff liaison be directed to forward the presentation to city staff.
I probably need to delete the Isabel Bachman. She was removed as part of the delegation today.
Yeah. So if we can have somebody to make the motion. Lorraine? Okay. And I guess all in favor? Okay, done.
Brian, could I say one last thing? I wanted to echo Kimberly's, because I think we all really appreciate it. And it was such a great opportunity to really interact with the committee finally. But I also want to recognize the counselors that were off and on during the session. I mean, I think that shows interest as well, and appreciate them taking their time to check in on what we had to say. So, as well as the city staff. So I like you, I feel like it's at the start of something positive, and I would love to contribute how I can, and I'm sure we all feel the same way.
Okay, thank you. So I guess you folks from the Mountain Locks don't have to stick around for the rest of the business if you don't wish to. You're dismissed.